like to introduce our panelists for today. I'm very delighted to have a number of very experienced and knowledgeable panelists joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending upon where you're calling from. So in sort of no particular order, just going around the screen as I can see them, we've got Dr. Zituni Old-Dada, who is a Deputy Director from the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and he'll be telling us a little bit more about the work that they're doing in the context of food systems a little bit later in this webinar. I'm delighted to have Avery Cohn, who's the Program Director of the for Food and Agriculture at the ClimateWorks Foundation. And we're particularly grateful to ClimateWorks because they've actually funded this project that we're presenting to you today. So delighted to have Avery coming to sort of give his view from the sort of the funder and the sort of broad systems perspective. We've got João Campari, who's the global leader at WWF in their food practice, has a huge amount of experience there, and they've been producing a number of really interesting reports that he will be sort of touching on later in this webinar. And then last but definitely not least, Patty Fong, delighted to have her on the panel as well. She's the Program Director for Climate, Health and Wellbeing at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And they too have been doing a lot of work around the food system and particularly with the sort of climate aspect to that as well. And she'll be talking about that a little bit later in this webinar. But what I'd like to do, perhaps slightly selfishly first, is to present to you the work that we've been doing recently around the food system. And we are particularly looking at the work that the financial markets need to do in this context. As we'll be talking a little bit later in this webinar, there are a number of organizations who are looking at the changes that need to take place in the food system as a whole. And what we've aimed to do in this report that we're publishing today is to really set out the role that private finance, the financial markets, the banking sector can actually play in the necessary changes that we need to see in the food system if we're to meet our climate and our nature and our sort of society, social development goals within the next, less than 10 years to get to 2030, and then obviously heading on towards 2050. Just briefly about Planet Tracker, we're a non-profit, finance-focused think tank, and our goal is to persuade financial markets to align with a sustainable future. And in the context here, we're looking at that from a food systems perspective. We're part of the Tracker Group. You may have come across our sister organization called Carbon Tracker, and they focus on the energy system, and we're focusing on a number of other systems, including, for the purposes of today, the food system. Now, the report that we published today is the result of an extensive program of work over the last year. It's built on a database of 400,000 companies, which has allowed us to establish a real-world framework for financial institutions to enable them to tackle the urgent food system transformation. We can see there's 8.6 trillion of funding is provided by the private sector to the food system, but the food system itself is responsible for about a third of humanity's GHG emissions and a number of other serious harms as well that I'll talk through in a few minutes. And our roadmap provides a strategic framework for financial institutions. It sets out 4 themes that they should be building into their investment processes if they want to help with transforming the food system, and 6 priority actions that we believe are among the most important that they should be considering to take with a matter of urgency. And if they do, the good news is that could actually cut the food system's GHG footprint by a dramatic amount, equivalent to 20% of the overall footprint of humanity. It could mitigate investment risks in the food system itself and generate very significant economic benefits. I'm talking about all of those points in more detail as we go through these slides. Now, you'll probably be aware the IPCC published its synthesis report coming out of its 6th review process, and they made the very clear statement that climate change undermines our health, it undermines our food security, it undermines our water supply, and it undermines nature. And the food system is integral to the harms that are currently happening, but also as a potential solution to many of those harms. Now, the food system, just to sort of summarize, I'm sure many of you know a lot about this already, but, as I say, responsible for a third of humanity's GHG emissions. Something like 86% of the species on the IUCN's red list are there because of the food system. The Living Planet Index has declined by 69% in the last 50 years. Much of that has been as a result of food system impacts. Over 34% of our fish stocks are overfished, and over 20% of global deaths are due to dietary factors. And then finally, the food system itself is extremely inefficient. Roughly a third of the sort of calories that start their journey at the beginning of the food system never make it into the mouths of the people they're supposed to feed. So the food system is essentially eating itself. The food system is destroying its own base. And if that continues, then we will not have a sustainable food system. We won't be able to feed the population that is estimated to be 10 billion by 2050. We will suffer a very serious systems collapse. So what we've set out in this roadmap, building very much on the work of many others, some of whom are represented on this webinar today, is to lay out a path for the financial institutions to drive the food system to where we need it to be. And a transformed food system will, by its very nature, be climate positive, it will be nature positive, and it will be people positive. But in addition to that, it will be resilient to cope with the climate change that is definitely coming down the track. Sort of whatever we do now, we're going to see climate change. The food system needs to be resilient in the face of that. It needs to be efficient. It needs to actually convey the protein that's produced at the start all the way to the people who need it as a key way of making sure that it's causing less harm, doing more with less. And it needs to be effective. It needs to get good food into the mouths of the people who need it at the times that they need it, so that they actually are increasing in health and increasing in well-being, and not being, if you like, poisoned by the very food system that should be supporting them. Now, as our work has progressed, what we've done is we've divided the food system up into segments and nodes as a way of analysing what's going on at different points in the food system. And as I mentioned earlier, this is based on a database of 400,000 companies, it covers 160 countries, and captures revenues of 10.2 trillion, which we estimate is somewhere between half and sort of 3/4 of the food system's total revenues. So again, you can immediately see there a significant skew in the system towards the very large companies. We estimate there could be somewhere between sort of 700 million and 1 billion businesses in the food system worldwide. We've just captured 400,000 of those, but that's very much the sort of the top slice, the biggest companies in the system. And you can see there how we've divided the food system up from sort of start to finish, beginning right at the very beginning with input providers, companies providing chemicals and machinery into the system, and then getting right to the other end, disposal. And I think it's worth just flagging that although we've got disposal on the diagram, we actually don't have any reliable food systems relating data to look at in terms of disposal. Unfortunately, company disclosures differentiate between whether they're disposing of nuclear waste or non-nuclear waste, but they don't tell you whether that non-nuclear waste was food or plastic or some other form of waste. So it's there in our scheme. As we get more data, we'll put it in, but at the moment we haven't got the information about that. The other thing that's worth emphasizing is this is a holistic food system database, so it includes seafood as well as food produced on dry land. And if you want to see more about how we've estimated the revenues of the system and the value of that system, there's a blog on the Planet Tracker website that you can refer to that gives you more detail on that. Just very briefly, in terms of some of the data that we found, in terms of the funding of the food system, as I say, 8.6 trillion is the estimate we've come up with for the private capital invested into the food system. You can see on the left-hand chart there the mix of funding in terms of the different sources. So quoted equity is actually very important in value terms. They form a significant part of the overall value of the capital invested. The other big part of capital invested actually comes from owners and entrepreneurs and retained profits within the system. So particularly in all the private companies that are not quoted on the market, many of them, of course, relying on their own internal resources. And then bank lending into the system also significant, but a smaller proportion. In terms of the private finance coming into the system, so the debt and equity, you can see the vast majority of it going to the middle of the supply chain, the manufacturers and distributors capturing 60% of the investment, producers and traders and the food retailers and the food service companies capturing a roughly equal proportion of what remains to be allocated across the system. So the majority of the funding going to what you might call the sort of the middle towards the downstream. The other thing we've been able to do with our database, and I think this is really interesting, is look at what companies are reporting in terms of their own environmental footprint. Now, the company reporting, it's worth saying the data are very sparse. Company reporting is pretty poor. A lot of the companies in our database don't report anything. So this this analysis is based on a relatively narrow slice of the companies in our database. But what's interesting is in spite of that paucity of data and that poor reporting, the overall sort of shape of the curve, if you like, is very similar to academic studies that have looked at the whole system. So we see that producers and traders are reporting the heaviest environmental footprint, and then the environmental footprint declines much more as you go further down the supply chain. Perhaps not a great surprise, and that aligns very strongly with what we can see from academic studies. What is then interesting, just to tie that into the funding we were talking about a moment or two ago, you can see that the bulk of the funding, as I mentioned, is in the middle of the system, and particularly at the upper end, the equity market is underrepresented, but the banking side of things is a bit more represented amongst the producers. So banking, but bank loans more important than equity finance at that end of the supply chain. And then finally, in terms of our database, just worth looking at the distribution of profits and revenues. So on the left-hand side, you've got the distribution of profits, and perhaps no great surprise to find the distribution of profits there aligned quite closely with the way that funding is also allocated across the system. And the really big companies, the big source of revenue is actually the manufacturing and distributing end of or middle of the supply chain, with the revenues then roughly equally distributed on either side of that. However, when you look at the profit side of things, this is where life gets a lot harder for the producers, and it's the downstream end of the supply chain that is really capturing the majority of the riches. And you can see there the retailers and food service companies capturing nearly half of the profits in the system, in spite of their quarter share of the revenues. So you can get a sense of the sort of the level of profitability coming through. Manufacturers and distributors capturing slightly less of the profits than the revenues, and the producers and traders capturing only 13% of what's actually available in the system. So profit heavily biased towards the downstream end, funding in the middle, environmental footprint at the upstream end. The other thing just to mention is that roughly 53% of the total revenues generated are generated by less than 0.1% of the companies in the system. That's effectively the companies in our database. So our 400,000 companies generating over half of the total revenues in the system. And as you can see from that chart, sort of 80% or so of the profits going towards the sort of non-producing activities. So what should the financial sector do? Well, in this roadmap, we've set out a series of actions they can take and a strategic framework that they can use. But financial institutions can't meet their net zero commitments. They can't meet their nature or biodiversity commitments. And they can't meet their SDG, their development commitments, without the food system being transformed. Now, policies, laws, and consumer opinion are already shifting in that direction. So there are risks to financial institutions if they carry on supporting a business as usual perspective, but there are also huge benefits potentially to them of really investing and putting their shoulders behind the wheel to arrange or to sort of help drive the transformation that's required. Now, this roadmap is very much designed to be the start of a journey. It's not the last thing that we're going to publish on this topic, and it's definitely the first stage in the journey for any particular financial institution. But we hope that the strategic framework we set out with 4 themes and the actions that we lay out in this roadmap will provide a useful and relatively easy, accessible starting point for financial institutions to really get stuck in the changes that are needed. Now, just in terms of a high level for a moment, we've looked at a lot of different sort of reports and studies that have been done around the food system, and they come up with a whole variety of different recommendations. We'll be talking about some of them later in this webinar. But we've summarized the sort of framework that is embedded in a lot of these reports into these three transformation pathways, which we set out and discuss in our report. That will all lead to a transformed food system by 2050. So protecting and restoring ecosystems, improving food production processes, and ensuring the demand side sustainable consumption is also addressed. But the challenge with these transformation pathways is they're a bit too high level for financial institutions to really sort of grapple with effectively, and they involve dealing with a number of things that are rather outside the remit of financial institutions in terms of perhaps consumer behavior or changes to regulation, which can be harder for financial institutions to actually sort of effect change in those areas. So what we've done is we've set out a 4 food transformation themes framework for financial institutions. And they can use this framework to build their own investment policies and engagement policies. So if they can build their own frameworks on this framework, they can be satisfied they're covering the bases that they need to. And the 4 key components, just running through them very quickly. Responsible supply chains. You can see from the analysis that I talked through just now, there's a split, there's a divide between where the money is, where the profit's being made, and where a lot of the harms are taking place. And we need downstream actors and the investors, the funders in those downstream actors to take responsibility for what's going on upstream and to help to change, to make the changes needed in those upstream areas. And that requires supply chain linkage. So we need people to be taking responsibility for their supply chains. Secondly, the system is very wasteful. It's very inefficient at the moment. And one of the key ways to stop the food system sort of continuing to crash beyond its planetary boundaries is we need to make it more efficient. We need to do more with less. So we need to be able to produce more profit and more nutritious food for people, while at the same time consuming less land, having less harmful inputs, having less water use, and all of the sort of inefficiencies in the system. But notice the key phrase there in brackets. This is an increase in true cost efficiency. So we're not just talking about efficiency in terms of having a 10-story pig farm instead of a 5-story pig farm, or an even bigger cattle feedlot, or whatever it might be. This is looking at the real environmental and social and nature costs of the food system and taking those into account when increasing efficiency. Very strongly linked to that, the food system currently is very polluting. Talked about GHGs, it produces a lot of plastic waste. It's a very significant emitter of methane. It's causing a lot of nitrogen pollution as well. A whole variety of unpleasant things coming out of the food system. And clearly, in order to end up with a nature positive result, we need to reduce that pollution. And of course, it's a source of inefficiency as well. So the two things link together. And then finally, the previous slide I talked about sustainable consumption. From a financial institution's perspective, it's very hard to change consumer behavior. And actually, we don't think that's where the problem really lies. Most of us will sort of consume what we're allowed to, as it were. So if you go into a shop and there are chocolate bars on sort of, buy one, get one free, and they're right by the till, then you're quite likely to buy a chocolate bar. In fact, you'll take the free one as well, and then you'll run straight home and consume them. And the same is true of all sorts of fast and highly processed foods that our bodies love them. The advertisements bombard us with all these sort of emotions and motives, and so we run out and consume food that is bad for us. So consumers, it's quite hard to just sort of change one's own behavior. Responsibility, we believe, lies with the food production companies and the food retailers and the food service companies. And those, of course, are the companies that are right at the heart of where the capital markets are investing. They're the companies whose behavior can be changed by the people funding them. So sustainable product offerings, we believe, should be the fourth theme in this framework. Getting those companies to really take responsibility for the way they design the food they produce and the way they market it. So that's the strategic framework. Now, many financial institutions we speak to say, well, great, we'll do that, but that's going to take some time. Are there things that we can be cracking on with immediately to really begin to produce a result? And that's where these 6 priority actions come in. Now, there are 6 of them. You can definitely do all 6 and have a great effect. You could pick on 1 or 2 if that sort of fits with your portfolio and your investment structure. But we picked these because they all have an immediate effect. They're all well within the grasp of financial institutions, and they align with a number of initiatives that are already out there. So to an extent, there's a sort of plug and play aspect for a financial institution. You can get on with these actions. There are already quite a lot of information and support around there. And you can see what the actions are. So fully traceable supply chains. Our analysis shows that investing in traceability systems actually adds profit. So that's a complete no-brainer for a financial institution. You will make money by persuading your companies to have traceable supply chains. Halving food loss and waste, it's massive inefficiency. If the food company you're looking at can be less wasteful, then by definition, it's going to be more profitable. So that is also an investment no-brainer. Stopping deforestation, this of course is a process or a theme that's been running for a number of years with perhaps rather limited success, certainly in terms of financial institutions. But if you want to get a net zero portfolio by 2030, stopping deforestation is the simplest and the biggest bang for your buck. So we really believe that financial institutions should be strongly getting behind stopping deforestation and land conversion. Cutting methane emissions, similar. Methane has an 80 times stronger warming effect than CO2. The energy system is a strong producer of methane, but so is the food system. And again, you get a really big bang for your buck by making sure that you're engaging with the companies that are currently responsible for this, big meat and dairy companies particularly, and getting them to find ways of cutting their methane emissions, including, of course, getting the whole system to switch away from meat towards alternative sources. And that ties in with that 6th action, and indeed the 5th to an extent. Making agricultural systems regenerative, again, is a no-brainer. You want a system which doesn't destroy its capital base, but actually benefits it. And then alternative protein production, we need to have other ways of solving the food problem that we've got. We can't just do it with the land that we've got with the current inefficient system. We need some alternatives. And again, that's an area for strong investment growth. A couple of things just to finish up with. In the roadmap, we lay out a series of questions and questions, probably the easiest word to use, questions that financial institutions should ask themselves and ask their investee companies as they are tackling any one or all of these different actions. Finishing up there, as you can see, with reporting. Financial institutions need to hold themselves accountable and to make themselves accountable to the general public and to regulators for what they're doing, not just put all the pressure on the companies that they are investing in. And in terms of the benefits that will come out of our actions, again, you can see all the details of this in our report. But as I said earlier, we estimate that this could, just taking these 6 actions, could reduce humanity's GHG footprint by 20%. So that's a not inconsiderable amount. And there are some very significant gains to be had. So these estimates come from a report that was produced by FOLU. Our estimate for the traceable supply chains, the rest of the estimates are theirs. And you can add up annual profit increases totaling 1.5 trillion, 1.6 trillion US dollars. If all of those actions were taken, that would be the profit uplift for the system. You can find a lot of information on our website that already supports some of these changes in terms of things like deforestation and traceability. So how to trace 600 billion in the food system, for example, and our report on methane hot money. But lastly, before I close and open up to our panelists, just to re-emphasize that we think the food system is absolutely integral to solving our linked climate and nature challenges. We also believe there are huge investment opportunities out there for financial institutions. So that's why we think the financial sector, private finance area, is so crucial to changing the food system. So what I'm going to do now is throw open to our panelists. So if you would all like to turn your cameras back on again. Thank you very much indeed. So a lot there about the financial sector, but of course the food system is much, much broader than just sort of the private finance sector. So Avery, I wanted to start with you, if I may. I know that you personally and ClimateWorks as a foundation has been very sort of keen to drive forward the concept of having a roadmap for the whole food system. Why do you think that's needed? What's the point?
Sure, thanks, Peter. And hello, everyone. As Peter mentioned before, I lead the Food and Agriculture Program at the ClimateWorks Foundation, and there we're working on issues really similar to what you've heard Peter talk about today. We think it's very important to have a roadmap and an understanding of transition pathways for the whole food system. You know, the author J.R. Tolkien famously reminded us that not all who wander are lost, but when it comes to transitioning food systems, we really don't have time to wander any longer. The latest IPCC synthesis report, as Peter mentioned, reminds us that we're really badly wandering on food systems. I'm thinking in particular of the statistic that shows there in that report that investments and mitigation solutions in food systems would need to be 10 times to 30 times higher to meet the needs we have to mitigate emissions in the sector. This is the worst showing of all the sectors in the report, and it bespeaks, in my view, the need to build considerably more political will on the food system transition and also build better understanding on how to transition food systems. So I want to congratulate Planet Tracker on this report, which does a lot to help to build that understanding. But we have more to do. We need to explore how pathways for transitioning the system can combine considerations on mitigation, adaptation, nature, and nutrition. And this report is a really nice step in that regard. It's also great how this report is showing how we are needing to take actions all the way from the farm to the fork. We can't take just supply side solutions. And so that's a very welcome approach. We'll need more from governments as well. We saw some promising beginnings of actions from governments at the United Nations Food System Summit held in 2021, where over 100 governments put together national food system pathways. The issue there is those pathways are not as ambitious as they need to be. They need to be linked to the globally agreed goals that we have on climate, both mitigation and adaptation. Also our new goals on nature and sustainable development too. A push for that is going to help. Then we'll need to translate those pathways to priority actions. And ultimately, doing that can help us to build an understanding of the kinds of risks that businesses face if they are behind the curve on aligning with plans governments have to transition the food system through their priority actions, investments, and interventions. And so very important in this sector, like in energy, where we have made use of the IEA Net Zero Energy Outlook as a framework for coming together, understanding how to link the global with the regional, setting benchmarks for investors, helping them to make plans to transition their businesses, both to reduce their emissions and to invest in the future. And we need a similar process and approach in food systems too. And just to be clear, food systems, they are not just nature or nature-based solutions. They do touch on energy as well. So when we do this work, we need to be thinking about the linkages between the food system and key components of the energy system that touch food. And that includes renewable energy on farm. It includes bioenergy and biomaterials. And it also crucially, as we've seen over the course of the last year plus with the Ukraine crisis, it crucially includes the future of fertilizer too, a key source of demand, residual demand for fossil emissions, but also the source of over 60% of all calories in the food system today. And so we call on continued work to build this sort of understanding about the linkages between public policies and business decision-making and investment in the space. We welcome this report, and I want to congratulate Peter and the rest of the Planet Tracker team on helping to advance this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Avery. That's very kind, and some really important points there that you made, particularly as you say, in terms of countries having some countries having food system pathways, but really lacking ambition. Zituni, can I turn to you, because we were on a panel together in COP27 in Egypt, and you made the bold promise to that the FAO would sort of help to produce the sort of roadmap that I think Avery was talking about. And so I guess the question is, one, are you producing a roadmap like the one Avery wants, or is it going to be slightly different? And how's it going? What's the project's sort of progress so far?
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone, and congratulations for this roadmap that focuses on the financial sector. It's really very, very helpful. It sets out the 6 very clear priorities going forward. On the food roadmap that I mentioned, yes, indeed, we're progressing with developing it. Actually, we want an agri-food systems roadmap that focuses on not just the 1.5 degrees C, but also SDG 2. So this is how we're framing it, for the overall global food security, touching on the climate target. So we're looking at the timeframes of 2030 for the SDG 2 and net zero to 2050. So these are
sorry,
two.
Just to interrupt, for those who are not aware of the SDG 2, that's the zero hunger ambition.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, thank you. So yes, the Paris Agreement goal, 1.5 degrees C, and the SDG 2 to eradicate hunger by 2030. And the roadmap is really intended for policymakers and investors. So we want to be able to do is to have this roadmap launched by COP28. So that's the timeline we're aiming for. And the first is to give a global roadmap that shows the key pathways that we need to look at carefully to achieve the transformation of agri-food systems we want, and to achieve the point that you mentioned, Peters, for making these agri-food systems more effective, more sustainable, more inclusive, and also more resilient to the impact of climate change and other shocks that unfortunately the agri-food systems are very much vulnerable to. So this is the objective that we're working on, and the work is going according to the timeline that we set out to deliver this by COP28. But one important aspect to highlight here is, we want to dive into more detail afterward, because the agri-food systems are very complex, obviously. They are very different from one part of the world to another, and it's affected, as you know, by culture, by local circumstances, by capacities. So we want to be able to give a big picture first, because we don't have time really to do this justice and give too much detail by COP28. But then after that, we'll be looking at the aim is to look at regions and possibly some countries as well, but just to be really more specific in some of the pathways that we want to look at as a priority going forward. So this is the aim, and we're very much looking forward to really having this roadmap, because unfortunately at the moment we don't have such a roadmap that gives a broad picture of the key pathways that we look at. There's so many things happening in isolation with regard to, say, the food loss and waste, the harm mitigation aspect, but also the adaptation, healthy diet, protection of the environment and biodiversity. But all these, our aim is to capture them and then to see what needs to happen with some discrete targets, and also timeline to 2030 and 2050 to the net zero. So that's the aim, and work is in progress, and watch this space. And we look forward to any ideas, any suggestions that anyone would like to bring in, such as the roadmap that you presented, Peter. Because one of the things we want to do is to do some mapping on what roadmaps exist out there, so we don't duplicate certain aspects of what we're trying to do. So I leave it here and happy to come back if needed. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. That was a really helpful summary, and great to hear that the project is on track. It must be one of the few projects in the world that currently is. So congratulations. Certainly very few of those in the UK at the moment, but optimistic. We'll look forward to COP28 to hear more about that. João, if I could turn to you now, because I know that WWF has been doing some really interesting work on sort of country food system pathways, and I wonder if you could tell us more about how you take a sort of a broad concept that we're talking about in our roadmap, and you actually bring it down to a much more sort of country specific level.
Yeah, Peter, thank you very much. Delighted to be here with you and our friends in the panel. In WWF, we take a systemic approach across food production, consumption and diet, and food loss and waste. So there is quite a bit of an alignment between some of our priorities at WWF and those actions highlighted in the Planet Tracker report. I'll cite a few. For example, a call to halt conversion, adopt nature-positive production practices, and improve traceability. Also to shift to healthier and more sustainable diets, having food loss and waste, and to cut emissions and halt biodiversity loss while improving livelihoods and equity within the food system and across food systems. So we work at WWF at a global level to influence and shape agendas for full food systems transformation, working with all kinds of stakeholders on policy, finance, trade, science, and so on and so forth. So through our WWF network, our country offices are the true vehicles of change. So we have presence in nearly 100 countries and are implementing over 200 programs across all continents on food system transformation. So the critical question is, how do we translate global frameworks, concepts and themes into action on the ground and in the water that benefit nature, that deals with climate change and people as well. So there is no silver bullet. So I should agree with Zituni and Avery before that. There is no silver bullet, and we need local solutions for local contexts. So you would see that the work we do in Malaysia, for example, is quite different from the work that we do in the UK or in Brazil. So you mentioned the framework that we have developed at WWF to help national level decision makers identify the most impactful actions for their food system. So we are at a critical juncture for nature, climate, and food security. Transformation needs to rapidly accelerate, which means that there has to be laser focus on doing the things that will deliver most impact everywhere, right? So investing in the right solutions in the right place at the right time is quite challenging, but we need this to deliver impact. We call it WWF, the right solutions at the right place at the right time, the great food puzzle, right? It's not easy to deal with the three aspects of this. So it is a puzzle that we need to resolve together. So the foundation of our framework of the WWF food puzzle is a food systems typology that categorizes various food systems around the world. We need local solutions, but groups of countries do share similarities and can and should learn from each other. So this is the departing principles of our work. A few organizations have developed food systems typologies, but ours doesn't use just geography, industrialization level, or volume of food production. We also look at the breadth of biodiversity, carbon stocks and stores, and consumption patterns. So we are considering how food systems can deliver benefits for both people and planet simultaneously. Alongside the typologies that we put in place, we have identified a set of 20 levers that cuts across these typologies, all of which are likely to be required in each type of food systems, but offering varying degrees of impact from place to place. And one of these levers is finance. So it speaks directly to the report that you're launching today. So there were several recurring points that I saw in the Planet Tracker report that align to some of our levers, the 20 levers that I mentioned. The need for improving data, for example, or improving collaboration, improving reporting and transparency, for instance. So we've conducted initial analysis across several countries to begin to plot which levers may be most impactful in different food system types, and are currently analyzing a second group of countries. We are onboarding now 12 more countries. This will be published in the fall this year. So Identifying which of these levers can have the most impact is the first step, but stakeholders also need to consider which specific actions will work in different food system types. For instance, promoting alternative protein sources could be a high impact lever in several food systems types. But what action is best in place? Is it imitation meat substitutes, or is it increased bean consumption or cultivating insects? So it's different from place to place. In May this year, we are publishing a supplementary report at WWF addressing these kinds of questions to help decision makers invest in the most appropriate rather than the most novel or topical solutions. We're already working with several of our country offices to translate these global frameworks into detailed pathways that can accelerate implementation in country. And we're working alongside national level decision makers to convene the various stakeholders that need to be involved to effect the food systems change. So when I talk to my colleagues working directly on the ground, the issue of finance is always brought to the fore. So driving more sustainable investment in our food system is critical to implementing the right solutions. So the work done by the Planet Tracker team really complements what we've been doing at WWF. So to be able to resolve this great food puzzle that challenges all of us, no organization can work alone. So I'm very happy at WWF to be working with all the organizations that are present in this panel today and many more to effect the changes that we need to happen in the food systems. And once again, congratulations for this really, really fine report. Over to you, Peter. Thanks.
Thank you, Joao. That's very kind. But you mentioned a number of really interesting things there, and I thought that sort of most appropriate solution or solutions was a really key concept, and I guess that's an area where our roadmap will need to provide further granularity to financial institutions, because again, sort of not every solution is going to be appropriate for every company in every particular locality. But the fundamental theme that's sort of come out so far, and Avery mentioned this at the start, Patty, I wanted to turn to you about this. We simply haven't got enough investment going on in the food system, even just simply within the sort of the climate context. Far too little is being done, and GAF has done some really interesting work on this. I wondered if you could sort of tell us more about, if you like, how little is being done at the moment, but more importantly, what really needs to be done in terms of the overall level of investment going into solutions.
Great, thanks a lot, Peter. And first, I want to congratulate you on this report, this roadmap coming out. It is so timely and needed at this point, and looking forward to the FAO's roadmap as well, and to Joao WF's context-specific roadmaps. This is something where I'll kind of share some insights from a couple of reports we put out last year. We looked at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. These are national climate action plans that countries have committed to developing when they sign up to the Paris Agreement. And what we found is one, food systems aren't prioritized, that food system stakeholders across the board, whether you're producers, you're in the health sector, you're consumers, they're not being consulted or integrated into the process. So, if WWF is leading on this in specific countries, this is so important to really set an example of how to do this right. And we then looked at how much climate finance is going into food systems. And Peter, you mentioned early on in your presentation that food systems contribute to 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, only 3% of climate finance. So this is dedicated funds for climate is going towards food systems. Now, why is that? Well, if you're not prioritizing food systems in your climate action plans, you're not going to unlock sources of finance, right? So that's the first step. Countries need to prioritize it, have ambitious plans and measures, and then cost it out. When you have this level of detail, you can then attract different sources of finance, whether it's public or private or some type of blended nature of it. We found that of all the NDCs, those national climate plans that were submitted, 70%, so nearly 3/4, lacked any sufficient detail. So this is really a first step that, next round of these plans are due by 2025. The kind of awareness and need calling for food systems to be prioritized in the climate agenda is rising. So hopefully this will continue to increase as countries start to look at revising their plans over the next couple of years. Secondly, on the role of the public sector and public finance. So, your roadmap focuses on the private sector. We looked at the role of public finance and governments. And we found that more than 600 billion a year is spent on agricultural subsidies. The majority of that have no environmental conditionality. This means that this funding, this public sector funding, is potentially harmful for climate, for biodiversity, for health. This is twice the amount that it was estimated to be needed to basically transform food systems to be sustainable and more resilient. So it's estimated that between 300 to 350 billion a year is needed, and twice that amount is actually spent on agricultural subsidies. That is not actually aligned with that goal. And this amount actually is 57 times greater than what is being spent on food systems from climate finance sources. And most of these subsidies are spent on emissions intensive and unhealthy commodities such as sugar, beef, dairy, and rice, or some of the top 4 examples. This type of agricultural support is basically incentivizing increased production and basically lock-in or dependency on these commodities. It's disincentivizing investments in healthier, more nutritious, diverse, and even culturally appropriate foods. And as a result, it's eroding traditional knowledge and practices. By relying on a narrow scope of products, we're weakening our resilience against climate change and other crises. So we do need governments to lead by example. If governments aren't leading, the private sector won't follow along. So this is, for me, it's a prerequisite for this type of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Yeah, that's a horrifying number. We quote that number in our roadmap, and I was quite sort of upset when I came across the sheer scale of sort of public finance and, as you say, subsidies and tax regime that is literally biasing the system in the wrong direction. It's extraordinary how much of a sort of weight of money from the public side is pushing the food system in the wrong direction. That's going to take some turning around, and I think questions come up in the chat. Sort of, how do you get the two systems, the sort of private and public, to align? I'm not sure we have easy answers about that, but I think it's very, very clear that if the public sort of finance side of it, particularly tax and subsidies, continues to push in the direction that you were alluding to, the wrong direction, then it will be very hard for private finance on its own to really make the difference that it needs to. So one of the fundamental things that we absolutely need is to see a congruence between those two sides. And there's an element that private finance institutions, they can play, they have a role to play in that. They can lobby governments, they can lobby regulators, they can seek to get the companies they invest in to put pressure on those governments and regulators. So that's definitely, that sort of policy side of things is certainly something financial institutions need to take account of as well. So we've got a lot of questions in the sort of Q&A and the chat. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I guess a way of sort of summarizing a lot of the questions together. You've each talked about a number of the sort of the challenges that the food system actually faces. And this is a slightly unfair question, but I'll give you a sort of a couple of minutes each to sort of have a go at it. If there was sort of one key change that you would really want to prioritize, what do you think that change actually needs to be? And maybe running on from that, who is then responsible, who's primarily responsible for sort of driving that change, and what can other parts of the system do to support that? Patty, maybe I can turn back to you first, if that's okay. What would you say is that the most important change? Pick two if you can't pick one, but...
All right, I would say that we need to start internalizing all the externalities. We've mentioned externalities related to environment, to kind of social costs, to our health. So we need to look at all the costs and benefits that are not currently included when we're looking at profits, when we're looking at current costs of the food system, especially industrial food system. So we need to make that more transparent. We need to require disclosure of all of these. We need to take into account in policymaking decisions and look at impacts on health, whether it's around hunger, undernutrition, or diet-related diseases, whether it's on environment, so biodiversity, climate change, pollution impacts, and society, how it's affecting exploitation of workers, of producers, whether it's eroding livelihoods, whether it's affecting access or rights to resources for producers, how it's impacting traditional or indigenous knowledge or practices. So all of these need to be taken into account and more when thinking about, reforming, putting in place new policies, when making investment decisions. How do we create a process to really take that into account?
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting. Well, it's depressing, really. Our review of these 400,000 companies showed that the data points that we could get consistently across sort of, well, not even all of them, but a reasonably sort of large slice was around GHG emissions, it was around water use, and it was around sort of waste. And the waste was not particularly sort of granular. So vast majority of the things you had on your list there, companies are not really telling us very much about that at all. So clearly a big gap. Joao, can I turn to you? Same question. One key priority and who's responsible? What would be on top of your list?
I think my number one priority would be that we need to be more and more impatient, right? I mean, we are like getting close. 2 years ago, close to 2030. That's the year in which we need to deliver the Sustainable Development Agenda, right? I mean, our solutions that will guide us towards the future beyond that. 2 years ago, I wrote an article that was called "The Last 9 Harvests." In that we had 9 harvests into 2030, and I question how much have we advanced. I revisited this article not long ago, and we have not moved the needle, right? We are fixated on refining the problems that we have in the food systems instead of seeking solutions, as imperfectly as they might look like. So we need to raise the level of our impatience. Oftentimes we think about, we contemplate like the trade-offs in the food system, but the trade-off that is most important now is the trade-off of time. We don't have much time. There are tipping points happening. They are emerging, and action does not happen at the very global level or with our own reports. I mean, our reports are tools for decision makers. So my number one priority is impatience towards the delivery of solutions on the ground, in the water, for nature and for people. We don't have time, guys. I mean, we need to use all the science is there. Now, you just contributed with the Planet Trackers report on a gap analysis to fill in the gap that we have for finance. Let's use all the science that we have: social science, physical science, policy. We already know what it takes. We need more action. So let's focus on delivering actions on the ground, in the water, for nature, climate, and people, as imperfectly as these solutions might look like. We're not going to fix the complete food system in 7 years, but we need to do the best we can using the expertise we have, and we have a lot. So that would be my call, Peter. Thanks.
Thanks, Joao. That's a really good call to action, and I guess that is our call to financial institutions. Yeah, don't start saying there's not enough data, we don't know what to do. It's get cracking on the things that are immediately to hand. Avery, what would your top priority be, and who are you holding responsible for it?
Well, my top priority would be to build on the success that we've seen in the energy sector of describing a positive agenda for how to transition that sector, where we see public policies and incentives crowding in private investments into the energy transition, setting standards, getting the public investments on the table, using that to catalyze the private investment, and doing it in a way that emphasizes justice. I'm thinking about the framework we saw in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to see something similar for the food system transition. We are in the midst of a food price crisis. We cannot do this by making food more expensive. What we need to do is make sustainable, healthy products cheaper, and we need to do it by crowding in investment and innovation in the space and outline a positive agenda. We tend to talk about the sector in some other way, like it's a place where we are going to do primarily carbon payments or primarily meat taxes. And what we actually need to do, in my opinion, is to bring together public and private sector actors to make it far cheaper to have access to the sustainable, healthy products that we need in the sector.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that positive agenda is really important. And it's you draw an interesting comparison with the energy sector, where, of course, now it's clear that renewables are dramatically cheaper than traditional sort of fossil fueled sort of energy production in a vast number of cases. So that sort of now becomes an economic no-brainer. But we didn't get there by accident. We got there as a result of policy decisions, and as you say, that positive ambition. Zitouni, so you're writing the roadmap. Maybe you're setting that positive agenda, but what would you put as top of your priority list?
Well, one of the top areas I would put is to start taking this seriously and to take responsibility across the board. As I mentioned earlier, the agri-food systems involve so many actors and people all around the world and across them in many disciplines and areas, and therefore everyone has to take the responsibility and do their bit, because unfortunately we're going backwards in achieving the targets, for the 1.5 degree, for the SDGs, for the biodiversity loss. Unfortunately, we are not acting fast enough and at the scale that is really needed to reverse, the impact that we've been having on the planet, and agri-food systems is one of the crises that we're facing, as you were saying earlier, in really addressing the sustainability and the resilience of these. So if we take this seriously, then obviously we'll start speeding up our efforts and combined efforts, because this is going to require a lot of work, a lot of changes across the board, because we have no choice but to change so many things that we've been doing for so long, things that concern the production system and the consumption system as well. So we have to start producing really in an effective and sustainable way, not just to produce food for the sake of producing food, but producing food that can feed and nourish people, and at the same time protect biodiversity and the environment. And I think we have also to harness really the power of innovation, and I mean innovation in the broader sense, not just in relation to hard technologies and digitalizations, but also innovation in a traditional way. We see people in certain settings where they use their imagination to have simple ways, simple techniques, simple tools that can really address the problem and the challenges they're facing locally. So for me, really, to sum up, is to take this responsibility so we can go faster than what we are doing at the moment. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And thank you very much indeed to all our panelists. We're actually up against the clock. So maybe if I can just sort of summarize what I think we've been hearing over the course of this discussion. We need a positive agenda. We need to incentivize and persuade people to move quickly down the right path. And we clearly need to have an alignment of public and private finance. We cannot have the two things moving in opposite directions. And Zitouni, you mentioned changing embedded practices, and I think that sort of highlights just the challenge of some of this, and particularly the fact that it really needs to be local solutions that are locally appropriate, culturally appropriate, and it's sort of accepted with enthusiasm by the people on the ground. But the point that you made, João, I think is absolutely fundamental. We've got less than 7 years until 2030. So we really need to crack on, and we hope that our financial markets roadmap provides a small sort of step, one tool in the toolbox that's needed. But thank you so much indeed to our panelists today. I think you've all succeeded in providing a really helpful broad sweep to the changes that are required in the food system. I had lots of questions coming in. We'll be collating those and sending them round so that those of you who didn't get answers to your questions live on the webinar, you'll get them from us to the extent we can after the webinar. As I mentioned, the webinar is recorded and it will be up on the Planet Tracker YouTube channel within the next sort of 24 to 48 hours. But it just remains for me to say thank you all to everybody who's attended, and particularly thank you so much to all our fine panelists. It's been a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for your insights.